I'm Assistant Technology Coordinator here at the Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue, and on behalf of all the staff here, I'd like to welcome you all to today's proceedings. There are just a few things that we need to go over prior to getting underway, and those are how the microphones work, how to adjust your seats, and of course where the washrooms are, okay? So let's start with the microphones. Now, the black cylindrical objects you have in front of you are in fact the microphones, and they're operated really quite easily. Just all you need to do, if you do have a comment to make or a question to ask, just raise your hand, and the chairperson, Rosalie, will answer you. And at that point, turn your microphone on by pushing the gray button that's directly underneath it. Don't do it all yet, or else all sorts of things will break loose. Anyways, push the gray button underneath. The microphone will alight, and you can say your piece. At the end, make sure you turn the microphone off. And a couple things to bear in mind. First of all, try to keep the microphone relatively aimed at you. Microphone aimed over there doesn't really get you anywhere, and unfortunately your contribution will be lost, okay? So that's the microphones. The seats, if you reach underneath your chair on the right-hand side, you'll find a lever. And if you manipulate that lever counterclockwise or back towards you and stand at the same time, okay, your chair will rise to sort of meet you, as it were, okay? The left-hand side, there's another lever underneath there, and that adjusts the back of your seat. Essentially, it's like any other office chair you've ever sat on in your entire life, okay? Now, washrooms, good news is that they are in this building. Bad news is they're just not on this floor. So what you need to do is go down to the concourse level, which is directly underneath us, which is accessed either by using the stairwell over here or the elevator on that side of the atrium. A couple of other things to bear in mind are that there is water in the room. We've set up stations on that side and on that for your convenience. Also, while we're talking about water, the washrooms, like I say, are down the concourse level. Women's is on that side, and the men's is on that. Okay? And that's about it. Thank you very much for your attention. And over to you, Rosalie.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Good afternoon and Happy New Year. Welcome to the Pacific Region Forum on Business and Management Communication. I'm Rosalie Tang, the Ming and Stella Wong Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lam Center for International Communication. We are very delighted to have with us this afternoon a man who truly needs no introduction, Professor Geert Hofstede. Professor Hofstede's name and his cultural dimensions have become synonymous with analyzing and understanding similarities and differences across countries. Professor Hofstede's book, Culture's Consequences, first published in 1980, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 16 languages. His work has been more widely cited than Karl Marx at times. The second edition of Professor Hofstede's classic work, Culture's Consequences, has just been published. The second edition has been completely rewritten, revised, and updated for the 21st century. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Professor Hofstede. His presentation will be followed by a Q&A period. Geert?
I hope it works. Thank you very much, Rosalie. This is definitely the most beautiful room I've ever been in. If the screen works, it's even better. The title of my speech will be Culture's Recent Consequences, which actually was invented because of the second edition of my book, Culture's Consequences. In the meantime, of course, we had some events which seem to be even more recent consequences of culture, and this is what they inspired me to think of. I don't know whether you know this picture. Anybody knows what it represents? Tower of Babel, yes. It's a picture, it's a painting by actually almost a countryman of mine. It's a Belgian painter, Peter Bruegel, from the 16th century, and this is the way he saw the Tower of Babel. Now, we all know the story of the Tower of Babel. At the time, it was supposed to be the tallest building in the world. And in fact, God didn't like this idea very much. And he confused the languages of the people who were working on it, and so it never got finished, and it became a disaster. You could say that was already at that time a kind of culture clash, maybe the first culture clash ever described in any document. You could also interpret the events of the 11th of September as a culture clash, and it was also around buildings, which at one time were supposed to be the tallest in the world, and also to be kind of all-powerful, the center of world trade. But obviously, there were also some people who had completely different ideas, unfortunately, and everybody knows what happened. So this is the title of my speech today, and this is, just in case I can't avoid having some commercial interest, so this is the new book that appeared, which is the second edition of a book that first appeared in 1980. I have to warn you, it is unreadable. Because it is really a scientific book, which is it's a compilation of the old book, and I would say about 75% of it is completely new. It is everything that people did about culture, partly using my concepts, partly using different concepts, since the first book appeared in 1980. But if you happen to be in research, I think it is nevertheless worthwhile to use it. Also, the subtitle has changed. If you have seen the old book, the subtitle was International Differences in Work-Related Values. Now, the new book is Comparing Values, Behaviors, Institutions and Organizations Across Nations, which is much more. Because, in fact, quite a few studies that appeared since showed that not only the values, but also the related behaviors could be shown by research to be related. Institutions are very important and organizations are very important. However, if you're not a researcher, if you're an ordinary human being, then the alternative is this book. It's the book Rosalie referred to, and this is a popular book, first appeared in 91 and second edition in 97. And this is the one that has been translated into 16 other languages, including Chinese, by the way, modern characters, including Japanese, including Korean, and which is readable. People tell me it takes about 4 evenings to read it. So that is more for more pleasant use. My dilemma at the present time is that usually in audiences, the audience is composed of people who know almost everything about my work and people who know almost nothing about my work, and they have to steer in between. So what I'll try to do is I will indicate the main lines. I will not assume anything known. On the other hand, I will be rather short about things that may be known so that people who know more about it don't get bored. The essential concept in the book is culture. The word culture is sometimes confusing because there are really 2 concepts of culture. If you look in the dictionary, you will find that there are 2 meanings, not including the agricultural meaning. And one is civilization. It's about libraries and theaters and literature and so. And the other is the anthropological term, which I've got here. And this anthropological term is what my book is about. And my definition is below that, and you will see it has 3 elements. First of all, it is something collective. So talking about the culture of an individual, at least in the way I use it, doesn't make sense. If you talk about an individual, you could talk about personality, but you could even talk about the values of the individual. You could not talk about the culture, because that is a collective thing. Then secondly, culture is something like programming. This is a metaphor. I don't mean that people are programmed the way computers are, but it means that you can't see from the outside, from just looking at the person, how that person, what that person's culture is. Of course, we do this all the time. We see people and then they look in a certain way and we assume, for example, if they look more or less like us, we assume they're programmed like us. Well, maybe they're wrong, and vice versa. So you have to see them in action before you can decide. You have to run the program before you can decide what the program is like. And the third part is that culture is something which one group of people have and the others have not. It distinguishes. It is not what we have all in common, which is human nature. It is not what distinguishes every individual from another, which is individual personality. It is something in between. And then the group or category can be the nation, which is what I will be talking about today, but it's also the organizations. Organizational culture is a very popular subject. It can be department within an organization. Anybody who works in an organization will be aware of that. Anybody who works in a university will be aware of the fact that university departments have their own cultures. Occupations, which I think is an understudied subject. Genders is a very interesting one. And also generations, where you will certainly be aware of the moment you, say, become second or even third generation yourself. Now, as I said, my talk today will be mainly about national cultures. And national cultures, thinking anthropologically, one of the things which anthropologists always stress, that in societies, different things are related. Things which do not immediately make sense on the individual level go together in societies, which means that if you want to understand a society, you have to look at the way families are organized, the way schools function, the way the job system works, the kind of religions that people practice, their economic behavior, their health and sickness, their crime and punishment, their kind of art, their science, literature, and in the end, management and leadership. So I very much disagree with people who write books about management culture or leadership culture. I don't think you can understand management or leadership without knowing something about other parts of culture. For example, people have asked me, what should I study when I want to do business in Russia? And what would you recommend to people who want to study, do business in Russia? What should they read? Any suggestion? War and Peace, Tolstoy. Yes. The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky. I mean, if you read these books, you see a society, and in fact, if you come to Russia, that society is still there. So you're prepared for the kind of surprises which you have. If we want to observe culture, you look at people behaving in a certain way. This diagram is known as the onion, obviously. It looks like an onion which you cut through. And what it means to indicate is that culture is practiced at different levels of depth. First of all, there is symbols. Symbols are words and objects and gestures that have a meaning in one culture but not in another. Let's take an object. Let's take the Canadian flag. Now, the Canadian flag has a meaning, maybe even a profound meaning if you're Canadian, certainly if you see it abroad. But some others don't know what it is. If the symbol has a meaning for you, it can even have, say, emotional reactions. Your heart starts beating faster when you see this beautiful flag, but for others it doesn't do anything. The whole area of language belongs to the symbolic level. Words have a meaning, and which means that language is really rather superficial aspects of culture. Superficial means that people over a lifetime are able to learn additional words, to learn even additional languages. The fact is that many of us, in fact, are today communicating in a language which is not the language in which we were originally educated. Heroes. Heroes are persons, live persons, dead persons, who stands as symbols also, or as examples of the kind of behavior that is either appreciated or particularly condemned in a culture. Rituals. Rituals are activities that are practiced for their own sake and not really for their technical effect, but for the effect that they may entertain a culture. One aspect of a ritual which is very evident is how you make a telephone call. When you make a telephone call, there are two phases. The first phase is you have to punch in the number, which is probably more or less the same in all cultures. But then what happens the moment you get a connection? Okay? I don't know about Canadians, actually. I know what happens, what I expect when I call a US person. What will I hear at the phone? Hello? Hello. Yes, okay. Okay. Now, I don't know whether you ever call somebody in Britain. You call somebody in Britain. What do you expect to hear on the phone? The phone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, or whatever their number is. Yes. If you call someone in our country, Holland, anybody ever tried it? What do we Dutch say in the phone when we pick up the phone? We say our name. It's probably related to the fact that we're also supposed to leave our curtains open in the evening. So if you walk through a Dutch town, you can watch the same television program if you go from one window to the next. But anyway, But of course, you all know, I guess, what happens if you call somebody from Chinese origin. Okay, what do you hear? Where? And the interesting thing about the where is that, I mean, if you have the hello, then usually there is one hello and then somebody on the other side says his name and you have the connection. But I noticed that the where goes back and forth a few times. It's where. And then at a given moment, probably sufficient commonality has been risen that you start really talking. Now, all these things, of course, are profoundly ritual. For example, I remember that when I was a student, and if I would pick up the phone and say hello, then, and suddenly when I had an older student on the other side, he would say, well, you stupid, can't you say your name? So you were trained in doing it that way. But it means that you indicate you belong to a certain group by doing that in a proper way. And also, of course, it makes a difference whether you call to your girlfriend or to your boss. Now, I've labeled in this diagram, I've labeled all these things practices because they are the visible aspects of culture. It doesn't mean that it's always clear why we do them, not even to the people who do them. If you ask these people, why do Americans say hello, why do British say their number in the phone? And, well, the people won't be able to tell you, but this is the way they've always done it. It's, doesn't any reasonable person do this? No. No. Reasonable persons from one place do so, but other reasonable persons do not. And then in the heart of the onion, there is a part which is values, which is the invisible part, which is the part which you only can conclude about by seeing people operate. Values are feelings with the minus and the plus pole, and some of the poles are evil and good, abnormal and normal, and you have a list there. And one of them, which I like particularly to point to, is that values are also related to irrational and rational. So what is rational is a matter of values, and this sometimes put me at conflict with my colleagues at the business department, especially the people with the training in economics, and they use rational choice models. And then I say, okay, whose rationality do you mean? Because rational choice in one culture is not the same as rational choice in another culture. Now that is something which some people at the World Bank have still got to discover. How do we get our values? This has something to do with the way humans are born. I like to compare this to the way horses are born. I don't know whether you've ever been present at the birth of a horse, but this is very impressive. It's very impressive, this animal. At the moment it's there, it unfolds its legs, it stands on its feet, and there is a complete horse which more or less can function like, can do anything a horse should do. Now this is of course not at all the case for humans. We are born completely helpless, but for this we have been equipped with a mode of learning which lasts about 10 years in the beginning of our life, where we can acquire an enormous amount of information, very subtle information sometimes, very quickly. And if you watch your children or other children, you will see how amazing the amount of learning is that can take place in that early period. At a given moment, around age 10, the mode changes. The learning is more, I say, more profound, but it's less fast, and it is on the basis of what has been learned beforehand. Now, the issue is that values belong to the part which is learned early in life. It's more or less like this. At very early ages, we learn primarily values. We don't learn many practices. For example, what would be the first values we teach to an infant? Well, maybe the first value they have to learn is the difference between dirty and clean. I think that is a very important thing. And interesting, if you go around, you will notice that what is considered dirty and clean in different parts of the world is not the same. What is considered dangerous and safe? To what extent are other people dangerous or safe? And so on. But after age 10, the weight of learning switches from values to practices. You can also see here that the learning of values takes mainly place in the family and a little bit in the school. The learning of practices takes place in the school and at work. And by the time people enter work life, they have their values pretty firmly in place. So attempts by, say, managers or whoever to change the values of employees are rather vain. The only way in which you can influence them is by hiring the type of people you want to hire. You can try to hire people with certain values, assuming they are available in a particular environment. Let's come back to the differences between countries. Now, countries differ in various ways, not only in their culture. In fact, one thing which is very evident is that if you are from different countries, you feel a different identity. This is very strong between Canada and the United States. I may mention that back in the 1960s, 70s, when I was on the international staff at IBM, we did a survey and we asked how people felt about working for an American company. And guess who were the most negative about working for an American company? The Canadians. It's the big brother effect, of course. But identity is very important, although some other people might say, well, the Canadians and the Americans have lots of things in common. But that is the Dutch and the Germans also have lots of things in common, which is one of the things I should never try to tell Dutch people. Okay, then there is culture, which is the software of the mind. And then there is the institutions that go with it, which obviously are related to the culture, because the organizations and the laws and rules which are visible should be based on the culture that is invisible. Identity is also visible, and identity is related to things like language and religion. And all of it, of course, is rooted in history. All of it has a history of many, many years, which also means that if you want to understand something about another culture, if you want to go somewhere and function properly, you must develop an interest in history. You must know about history. Identities are an important thing because identities are even the origin of wars. If you think of Eastern Europe, of the Balkans, and so also of the Afghanistan inside, then actually people fight each other very often on the basis of identities, although, in fact, their cultures are very similar. And the point is that identities are really a matter of practices, which means that they can be learned and unlearned. We are in Europe, we are at a very crucial moment in our history. As you probably know, the 1st of January, 12 European countries have adopted the same currency. Now, currency is also a very important source of identity. I was in Paris in December, and I saw a graffito on the wall that people called for defending the honor of France, defend the franc. So the franc would be defended, would be related to the honor of France, and certainly the pound is related to the honor of Britain. That's why Britain so far hasn't adopted the euro yet. Well, other countries are less peculiar, but I think, and a number of other Europeans think, that the fact that we now have a common currency will profoundly affect our feeling of identity. We will be among those people who have that same coin. But the difference is that identity are a matter of practices, and they can therefore be influenced. It makes sense for politicians to work on identities. Cultures are a matter of values, and they are carried along for life. If you got them before you were 10 years old, then they won't be easy to change, only in extreme circumstances. Which means that, say, if you have to decide about making changes, you can attempt to change identities, but you should take cultures as given facts and say, okay, these are the cultures I have to work with. I come to my own research, and well, those of you who've read something of my work know that I had first 4 and afterwards 5 dimensional national values, which were based on research. I'll say something more about that. They were based on statistical analysis, and basically what they point to, I say, is that every human society has a number of problems to resolve, but the solutions are not necessarily the same, so there is a range of solutions, but there are a number of problems which no society can escape from, and they are the basic problems, and you find them even in, say, world history. They have come back again and again. They existed already at the time of the old Egyptians and the old Chinese, and they are still around. And what are those problems? The first problem is the problem of equality or inequality. All societies are unequal, but some are more unequal than others. And I used the term power distance for that, and you will understand that if power distance is large, a society is more unequal. If power distance is small, a society is more equal, although all societies are to some extent unequal. Well, the second problem is that how does a society cope with the unfamiliar? Basically, of course, the future is always unpredictable. The future is always unfamiliar. And some societies seem to live with that fact more easily than others. There are societies that try to fight the unpredictable, that also feel that what is different must be dangerous. And there are other societies that are more tolerant and that say what is different is curious, it merits further study. And I use for that term uncertainty avoidance, and that may be strong, and then you have a rather intolerant society, and it may be weak, and it has a rather tolerant society. Okay, the third dimension deals with the fact that people live in groups. We are gregarious beings, and to what extent is the relationship with our group tight, or is it loose? Is it so that we expect that if we grow up we become more and more independent of our group? Or do we expect that if we grow up we become better and better members of our group? And then the fourth is related to the fact that we were born as girls or as boys without having been consulted before. We are just there at a given moment and find ourselves being a girl and being a boy. And what kind of emotional behavior does society expect from us? Whether we supply that behavior is another story, because individuals have a choice still of doing that or not, but there are societies where the emotional behavior of men and women is supposed to be very different, and usually that means that the men are supposed to be aggressive, assertive, and the women are supposed to be caring. And then there are societies where the emotional roles of men and women are supposed to be rather equal. But in those cases, it is always so that both men and women are caring, because a society where both men and women are aggressive is unstable. It couldn't exist. I mean, if everybody fights everybody, then society will fall apart. So societies where a relatively equal role of men and women, emotional role, are always societies which are more caring, more nurturing, and I call them feminine. You will also recognize that the old Chinese already had concepts for this. They had the elements of yang and yin, which also point in similar direction. And the last dimension is whether people want the gratification of their needs later or now. Whether a society teaches people to work very hard and to expect the reward for that when they're old, or whether the society teaches people that you should have your reward immediately, even you should have your reward first and do the work for it afterwards. About my research, originally I had data from the IBM Corporation in different countries. If you try to do comparative research between countries, the problem is always that you should find samples of people who are similar in the various countries. And this is not always easy. You should not compare soldiers in one country with nurses in another country, of course. You should find really equivalent samples. And more or less by accident, I got onto this database. I worked for IBM myself. I had been part of the team that collected it. The database was there. And IBM at that time was an extremely monolithic company with very similar organizations. And you could identify pretty much the same people doing the same work, working for the same machines and so. And they were a pretty ideal sample. But of course, this was around 1970. In the meantime, there have been at least 5 major replications in different populations. And in my new book, the Black Book, the unreadable book, you will find the descriptions of those. And one of it is elites. It's leading politicians, leading academics, and so. Another one is employees of other corporations. Another one, very interesting one, is airline pilots, covering more than half of all the commercial airline pilots in the world. A very new development is that these studies also include consumers. They have been adopted by market research organizations who, in their international market research, take comparable samples of consumers and ask those values questions. And the most recent one is among civil servants in 15 European countries. And what you find is that the results tend to remain quite stable, amazingly so even, if you realize that 30 years went past since those first data were collected. But it doesn't mean that cultures never changes. It differs a bit by dimensions. Some dimensions are very stable. Other dimensions, like individualism, they tend to change. However, the reasons why they change tend to be global reasons. And if a reason is global, it will affect all cultures. So even if they move in formation. So if what I've been doing, you look at the differences between cultures, although they all change, their differences remain the same. And this means that, say, any statistics you do on differences will remain extremely stable. I will not spend too much time on the positions of countries, but just give you some idea of what the research has shown about originally the IBM companies in those countries, afterwards supported by those other groups. And this is a combination of 2 dimensions. The first 2, power distance is PD, uncertainty avoidance is UA. Small power distance uncertainty avoidance, weak uncertainty avoidance means relatively equal and relatively tolerant. And you'll find there the Anglo countries, and the Anglo countries includes Canada, includes at least the English-speaking part of Canada. It includes the United States, it includes Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, maybe South Africa or part of South Africa. Also in that corner you find the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, and so on. You find my own country, the Netherlands. And let's now look at the other corner. There you find all Latin countries. There are something like what you could call the Latin mind, the Latin mentality, and that is a large power distance, relatively unequal societies, and relatively strict, relatively afraid of differences, relatively intolerant. You find East European countries there, virtually all of them, not the Central European countries, but the East European countries. And from Asia, you find Japan and Korea in that corner. Now, if you go to the lower left-hand side, you'll find countries that are relatively equal, but they are fairly strict, not very tolerant of differences. And there you'll find Germany, and you'll find Austria, and you'll find Switzerland, and you find Hungary, which was part of the same empire as Austria was, and you find Israel, at least Israel before the massive immigration of Eastern European and Sephardic Jews, because now I haven't got data about what Israel has become. And then in the opposite corner, you have the two largest countries in terms of people in the world. You have China and India, which have this combination of a large power distance. They're relatively unequal societies, but they are relatively tolerant of differences, which means they live fairly easily in an unpredictable situation. You might be aware that the Chinese people tend to accept the unpredictable much more easily than Japanese people do. And then combining the third and fourth dimension, which is the collectivism, individualism, feminine, masculine, let's first start now in the lower right-hand corner. And there is Canada with the other Anglo countries. The Anglo countries always together, always one cultural cluster, which are both individualists, as won't surprise you, and they're also masculine. It means that there are countries where at least men are supposed to be tough, aggressive, assertive, ambitious. But you also find there now, in the same corner, the German-speaking countries and the number of other countries in Europe, like Czechia, Hungary, Poland, and Italy. And then in the opposite corner, which is both collectivist and feminine, you find Thailand, you find Korea, you find Costa Rica and Chile, Russia, Bulgaria, Portugal, Spain, which is quite a mixture of countries which people would not immediately, I think, classify together. In the corner where cultures are both individualist and feminine, you find countries like Israel before the massive immigration recently. You find France, you find the Netherlands, my own country, and the Nordic countries. And then in the opposite one, both collectivist and masculine, now China and Japan are together. You find a number of the Caribbean countries, of Latin America. You find countries of the Arab world, and also you find Greece. Now, I won't go too deeply into this, because this is precisely, if you want to know more about this, read the book. Not the big book, but the small book. The last dimension is, in fact, originally wasn't there. We added this long, short-term dimension after research done by my colleague, Professor Michael Bond, who is a Canadian working in Hong Kong, and who has very good contacts in the Chinese world. And and we have been in contact before, and part of it was inspired by discussions we had together, because we wanted to know to what extent the fact that we found these dimensions, and he had also found something similar, that this would be influenced by the fact that we both had Western minds. And so he said, well, in that case, I know a solution. I'll ask my Chinese colleagues to make a questionnaire of values which are important in the Chinese tradition. And this was the Chinese Value Survey. And that showed that there was a dimension where the East Asian countries tended to score on one side, and where the Western countries tended to score on the other side. Except that when we expanded it, we discovered that the African countries and most Muslim countries scored even shorter than the Western countries. So in this case, the Western countries are more or less in the middle, and this is also in the Black Book, by the way, we had a research project specifically focusing on values which would be relevant for African countries, and also comparing African countries with countries elsewhere in the world. And we expected that maybe we would find another dimension. We did not. What we found is that all the African countries have only one thing in common, is that they score extremely short term. And it seems to be that it is part of the African cultural tradition to ascribe, say, the causality of things that happened, not to things you did in the past, but to other influences like sorcery, like witchcraft, and so like the guilt of other people. And if you want to have one illustration, is that the Prime Minister of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, still denies that there is a relationship between HIV and AIDS. Well, that is, to most people, even in the Western world, is a thing which has been accepted. It's a long-term consequence of something, but it is very difficult, I think, for the traditional African way of thinking to acknowledge that. Now, there may be a similar process in a number of Muslim countries, and some of the, in our eyes, dysfunctional behavior of people in parts of the Muslim world may also have to be interpreted in that way. So this is a new aspect of cultural differences, which I think still merits a lot of exploration. And certainly the question is, if you know this, what do you do about it? Do you say they're just as right as we are, or do you say, well, how do you want to resolve that? Or can't it be resolved? Okay, so far about the basic part of the dimensions. Now I want to show you two areas of application. In fact, with these different dimensions and the different score, you can do many things, and that is in my books the various studies that have used those dimensions for kind of purposes. I'll just mention a few which I will not discuss, but one of the most fascinating ones is a study by linguists. There is a couple, a Japanese-Australian couple, of whom she is a comparative linguist, the Kashimas, Yoshi and Emiko Kashima, and he is a cross-cultural psychologist, he is a linguist, and they have looked at languages from more than 70 countries, and they have looked at particular linguistic characteristics, and one of these is, for example, whether in that language the word I is pronounced. There are languages which pronounce, if you talk about yourself, you say I. There are others where the I is subsumed. For example, if in Spanish, if you are a man and you want to say, well, not even, it works for a woman too, but if you want to say to another person, I love you, you don't say, yo te quiero, you say, te quiero. So the io is subsumed. And in some of the Arab countries, pronouncing the I is even extremely sinful. You're not supposed to do that. It's almost satanic to use the word I. Now, interesting enough, if you look at those characteristics of languages and you look at the cultures of the countries, then this is strongly correlated with individualism. So individualist cultures tend to have languages that stress the word I, and collectivist cultures tend to have languages that do not use the word I, which shows something about the very old roots of the culture phenomenon. This is not a thing which will happen just, from one decade to the other. It has very old roots. It's linked to something fundamentally like the structure of the language. But what I would like to talk about is two subjects which are pretty topical at the present time, and they are human rights and they are corruption. Of course, there's a lot of talk about human rights nowadays. And it's not a very far-fetched idea that the way human rights are handled in a country is related to the culture of that country. So can we explore to what extent, say, the country's attitude towards human rights is explained by culture? Well, there is an index which was computed a number of times. That the last one I have been able to find was made in 1992, and this is by an author who calls himself Charles Humana. I don't know whether he calls himself that as a nickname or whether he's really called that way. But anyway, he has classified all the countries in the world, comparing them to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so you get a human rights index. And I did an analysis of those indexes computed by Mr. Humana, and my culture indexes, and I also took the wealth, the gross national product per capita. In fact, I've started to do that in all cases because it is a safe protection, I think, that if you want to show that something is related to culture, you first eliminate other reasons. And I think that something like the wealth of a country is a more direct influence than the culture. At least it's a simpler explanation. So I start with trying to see whether maybe wealth could explain something. And lo and behold, what do you see? The only statistical explanation of differences in human rights index was in fact across all the 52 countries I had data for, also on culture, was wealth, which means that in fact a good human rights standing is a luxury. It would also mean that if you want a policy, say you're the World Bank, or you are whatever, you are the United Nations, and you want to improve the status of human rights, you say, what should you do? What should you do to improve human rights in the world? Right, make the poor countries richer. Yes, very simple, I mean. However, if you look at a thing like this, then of course you say, well, maybe one of the reasons why the influence of wealth is so strong is that actually the mechanism is not the same for wealthy countries and for poor countries. And that was the next analysis. And the 52 countries they had could be divided at the kind of midpoint, which I think was a national income per capita in the year 2000 of $10,000. And then just about half of the countries were poor and just about half were wealthy. And for the poor countries, it was still only poverty. So if you're concerned with the explanation of the human rights standing of poor countries, it's still poverty. By the way, the 38% means the percentage of the differences that can be explained by the factor of wealth. However, in the wealthy countries, wealth itself did not play any role anymore, and now it became individualism. So it meant that individualist wealthy countries had a higher, better human rights standing than the collectivist ones, the more collectivist ones. Now, but that tells you, of course, as much about the measure, the yardstick of human rights standing, as it tells you about the countries. What you can say is that there is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. But that Universal Declaration was not really universal. That was made in 1948 by the people who at that time had the key positions in the political system. And who were they? There were people from the rich countries and there were people from individualist countries. So they described a number of human rights which then subsequently have been used as the basis of these human rights measurements. So that raises questions, not only, I think, of policy, of making the poor countries richer, but also of looking again at your definition of what human rights should be. And whether, for example, human rights, as many people have said already, human rights should only be formulated in terms of the right of the individual, or whether there should also be something like the rights of the group. Because there are, in fact, the majority of mankind lives in societies where at least the group, the collective, is as important as a basis for society as the individual. Okay, so far about human rights. Now, about corruption. Corruption is a thing which is immensely important. It's present everywhere, and it is very rarely spoken about. I say in classes on international business, well, you have to be pretty enlightened as a teacher to discuss the issue of corruption. In the same way as human rights was measurable, since about 5 years, corruption has become measurable, at least the perception of corruption. You can't measure corruption as such, because it's always somewhat hidden. But about 5 years ago, or maybe a bit more now, an international group has been set up in Berlin, Germany, calling themselves Transparency International, and they have been collecting estimates of the level of corruption from various sources, from businesses, from journalists, from diplomats, from international organizations. They have a list of the various sources they have, and they integrate these into something they call the Corruption Perception Index, and it's on the web. And if you have it's somewhere in my book also, I have the address, and you can look it up, and every year they have a new list. Now, of course, this is, again, the ideal type of thing. If you have a kind of approach as mine, this is a thing that is very tempting to relate to cultural factors. So what would you think is the first correlate, before I show you, what is the first correlate of corruption? If I look, in fact, let me see how many countries did I have. I had 46 countries where we had data from Transparency International and data from my indexes, and GNP per capita, by the way. What do you think is the first factor explaining corruption? And who are more corrupt? The individualist or the collectivist? Collectivists are more corrupt than it. Any other bid? Power distance. Power distance. Which one is more corrupt? High power distance more corrupt, yeah. Any other bid? GNP. Who is more corrupt? The poor ones. So now this time you get a complex picture. This time you get a complex picture because, in fact, the first correlate is poverty. And you see it's about 2/3 of the differences can be explained by poverty. In fact, if you are poor, if you're about starving, I think, well, corruption is always less bad than dying. So it's definitely preferable. So it is a very good reason to have more corruption in a society where people tend to be starving. But then, in fact, there is an additional contribution to the differences from power distance, large power distance, as you said. Not individualism in this case, but one which is there. Why would strong masculinity increase the chances of corruption? Aggression, competitiveness, yes. Yes. Yeah, you see, the fact is, in a masculine society, leaders want to be big leaders. It's the big man syndrome. And one of the ways of people to be big men is to get bigger bribes. But again, as you see, if poverty is such an important role, then very likely there is a difference between poor societies and wealthy societies. And in fact, there is a difference. Because in the poor countries, it's again poverty, it's less strong, and in addition to that, it is very strong. Influence of masculinity is almost as large as the influence of poverty. So, in fact, if you are a poor country, yes, if you're poorer, there's more chance of corruption. But if you're masculine, there is more corruption. And in fact, there is a large variety among poor countries. There are masculine poor countries, there are feminine poor countries, and in those there is less of a need to people of powerful people to enrich themselves. In wealthy countries, however, the story is different, but now the other dimensions appear, because you see that there is uncertainty avoidance. What does uncertainty avoidance mean? It means that a society is very much structures, and one of the aspects of that is uncertainty avoiding societies believe in experts. Uncertainty avoidance societies believe, in fact, is that the experts are the ones who know, and that the ordinary citizens are the ones who don't know. So they do not believe that citizens are very competent, nor do the citizens believe that they are very competent, so they have a tendency of leaving important decisions to the experts. Well, that is an excellent situation for corruption, because if the experts are corrupt, then they can use their expertise to enrich themselves. And this obviously is an influence that operates even stronger than the effect of power distance. But additionally, you were right with your remark of individualism, because in fact there's also individualism, and the more collectivist societies have more corruption, and which very likely is the effect of nepotism. I mean, if you have a collectivist society, you have your friends and people who are not your friends, and obviously you should treat your friends a bit better than the people who are not your friends, and so there are ways of getting them some payoffs. However, there is another interesting study which is a bit different from this one. It is a study done by a German-American who worked at an institute in Salzburg, Austria, and he did a study of elites. It's the study of Michael Hoppe. And the people who came to this center in Austria were, in fact, the top leaders of the countries themselves. In fact, they would be the people who, if in a country there was corruption, would be the prime candidates for being the corrupt ones. And they would be leaders of political parties, there would be members of government, members of parliament, labor leaders, there would be leading academics, and so on. And now, if we look at the data by Hoppe, then you find a very strong correlation. The 78% of difference is explained for these 19 European countries, including the USA, by the values of the elites themselves and the way others perceive the corruption in their country. So these are two completely different things. One is you had these elites who came to that center and who afterwards were asked about their values. They answered these questions, and there were about 1,500 of them. And they gave their opinion about these power distance factors. And on the other hand, there is the 2000 estimate by Transparency International of the corruptibility. And the two overlap 78%. So what means really that corruption is also very much between the ears in the minds of the people who are the leaders. And this is a very old citation, which maybe you've seen before. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton was a diplomat who became a Cambridge professor, and so he tried to interpret politics for academic purposes, and this is a conclusion which still holds. Now, to round off, this was Lord Acton's slogan. What is my slogan? My slogan is that nationality constrains rationality, which is, I said already that I'm not always popular with my friends who want to use rational choice models in economics. I think it is important to realize in international relations that what you consider to be normal, just, fair, clean is influenced by your nationality. And nationality stands, in fact, for the kind of society in which you grew up, the kind of relationship you had with your parents, the kind of relationship you had with your teachers, with your friends, also the wealth or poverty of the country you grew up in. It all influences this. And I think if we want to build one world together, we should be able to cope with this dilemma. Now, people ask about culture change. One of the things they ask me is that, yes, you talk about these things, but are they really cast in concrete? I mean, your data are already more than 30 years old. Well, they must be completely obsolete. I've already answered to that a little bit. But don't cultures change? Well, national cultures are, first of all, as I said, they are rooted in values learned before age 10. Which means that if they have to change rather slowly, because people will live for 60 or 70 or 80 years, and it takes a generation before somebody with new values can come up, and also the new generation is taught by the older generations. Well, we've all read about politicians, especially the ones who want to be elected, who promise that they will change the values of society. They want to reinstate family values, for example. And, well, some priests or religious leaders do the same. And even some chief executives, officers of companies, sometimes declare that this is precisely, if now that they have come to power, what they will do is they will change values. Well, I think that this is arrogant. I think this is unrealistic. I think this is a lack of insight in how the human being and society is really made up. And what it means is for people who are running business, for people who are running organizations, that values are and national cultures are given facts. You may want to change organizational cultures, that's a different story, but I won't talk about that now. But the national cultures are factors you have to take as given facts and start from there. And expecting national cultures to change when you come in is something as likely as expecting water to start running uphill instead of downhill. It also means that multinationals are not kept together by shared values, but by shared practices. And now we come back to the origin of my own research. My own research was done within this one multinational, IBM. And the differences in values I showed you were basically first found in this single multinational. So it shows already that IBM, which at that time was a very successful multinational, could operate in spite of these considerable value differences inside. Because what kept the organization together were not the shared values, but the shared practices, the shared symbols, the shared heroes, the shared rituals. And this is the name of the game if you want to globalize, if you want to run successful international organizations, is to find the shared practices that people with different values, with different cultures, will be able to share. Now, another slogan, the slogan which you probably have all read is Think Global, Act Local. I was told this was originally invented by market research organization Saatchi & Saatchi. And I've seen that there was a new CEO of Coca-Cola after Coca-Cola got in trouble in about 2000. And one of the reasons it was, according to the new CEO, it was in trouble is because it was much too international. He said, Coca-Cola is a product which is drunk by the small consumer locally, so we should think local and act local. But I would interpret it as slightly differently again. I would say my recommendation is to think local. Think global is nonsense. I mean, think global is the idea that anybody can think global is arrogant. I hope if there's anything you can take home from this talk is that we all think local. We can't think differently from the way we learned to think, and that was local. But in spite of that, we can still do things together with each other. So the name of the game is Think Local, Act Global. In fact, to the extent you understand German, the German translation of my readable book is called Lokales Denken, Globales Handeln, so which is Think Local, Act Global. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was what I wanted to say about the subject, and that leaves us, hopefully, some time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Hofstede. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Steve reminds us that if you have a question, if you want to make a comment, please press the button, the little gray button under the microphone, so that you can be heard, and secondly, you will be recorded. Yes?
I'm curious, the basis for your assertion that values are learned fully by the age of 10 and they don't change after that. And I would assert that there are people who've gone through wars who have changed their values much later after the age of 10 because of what they experienced.
Thank you. There are individual extreme situations where probably people would change their values after that age. Most people would have most of their values established before age 10. That's what I mean.
So, firstly, is that not changing with our current age of media, which is one of my areas of expertise? And secondly, are there not universal values? And in fact, I have heard people speak to universal ethics that cut across cultures. So could you comment on any of that?
Yeah, two questions you ask. One is the media. I would believe that the media are less powerful than they believe themselves. If you work for the media, you have an obvious also an interest in more or less overestimating the power you have. The media very often also are only effective to the extent they send messages which are already in harmony with the existing values of their readership. The other one is, what was the second question?
Universal values.
The universal values. There are people working on this. In fact, you could say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an attempt to formulate universal values. I have not seen a satisfactory result, and I think it's a worthwhile exercise, and there are certain elements of universal values. There are, for example, elements which are present in the philosophy of Socrates and in the philosophy of Buddha and in the philosophy of Confucius, all established about 500 BC, like the golden rule that you should treat others the way you want to be treated yourself, or you should not treat others, that's another version, the way you would not like to be treated yourself. So those are common elements. So I think that there would be probably a common element there. I don't think that there will ever be a set of common ethics which everybody would subscribe to. And maybe that's a good thing, in fact. It keeps it moving.
I'm struck by the idea of all of us wandering around at 10 with quite formed values, and I do tend to agree with you. But one of your sentences was, national cultures are therefore very stable and are passed from generation to generation. And I'm just wondering whether it's easier to feel that way when one is a European than in a country like Canada, where it's hard to, those 10-year-olds have come from such a variety of families now, not so much when I was a child, but certainly for, children in grades 3, 4, 5 nowadays in our big city, their first 10 years are quite varied by so many different national origins. So I'm just wondering about that stability, and I feel that Canada and the United States and Australia and the other countries may be quite different from some of the Asian and European countries in that stability.
Yeah, you're certainly right, except that many European countries are in the same situation. European countries have also become immigration countries. And there is a dominant culture, I would say, and there is a cultural adaptation process. You see, if you come in as first-generation immigrant, then obviously you've got your package of basic values from your home country. And you take that along. And then you settle in the new country. And then there is a second generation which gets part of the values from the home and part of the values from the environment. And there has been good research. The best research I've seen was from Australia and New Zealand on the development of this process over time. And the general conclusion is that it normally takes 2 generations. So the first generation has the values of the original country. The second generation is somewhere in between. The third generation has adapted to the majority. And that majority culture is still pretty stable. So societies are able to absorb a certain percentage of newcomers without necessarily changing their own culture very much. If that percentage gets over a certain limit, and the only country I know where that is probably the case is Israel. Israel has gone through such massive immigration that more than half of the population was born elsewhere. And then you have the impression that that country changed completely and changed from, say, a Central European-oriented country to a Arab-oriented country, although they're not Arabs.
My cultural conditioning has told me that nepotism is a bad thing, and
what is a bad thing? Sorry.
Nepotism.
Yes.
And you mentioned that in one of your slides you were looking at the concept of nepotism as a form of corruption, and I'm wondering, are we presuming here that nepotism is a bad thing? Couldn't it be something that's seen as efficient and logical in one culture and maybe as something corrupt in another? And so, hence your definition of corruption in that area of application you were mentioning.
Well, we have words, of course. I mean, nepotism has. If you want to, and you want to say that it's a bad thing, you use the word nepotism. If you want to say it's a good thing, you use the word guanji, or something like it. I mean, there's always for everything there is a positive term and a negative term. And if I belong to one culture, I have a positive term, and if it's about the others, I have a negative term. I mean, like, I can say I am principled, but somebody else say I'm dogmatic.
Hello. Something I've always thought about when I've been thinking about your studies is the question as to whether you think individuals are truly capable of reporting accurately on their own cultural values. Because I believe your studies are all based on self-reporting. And I sometimes have a sneaking suspicion that cultures kind of have 2 levels of values. There's the level of values that they say they have, and then there's the level of values that is actually manifested in the way life rolls forward. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't think that any individual is able to report accurately on himself. I mean, and also the kind of data I use are not therefore valid for individuals so much. But individuals will answer, if you ask them questions, they will answer in terms of a context. They will answer, if you ask individuals to describe themselves, they will not describe themselves in the way others see them. They will describe themselves in the way they would like to see themselves. However, that differs from one society to another, and this is precisely the kind of information I'm after. So everybody lies, but they lie in different ways, and this is precisely what tells me what I want to know.
I have 3 questions. The first is that to the extent that your dimensions are universal and they reflect then an interrelationship of fundamental conditions, what would then be the real benefit of representing the 2-dimensional correlations, like you showed P, D, and U, A interactions, and then you showed the other 2 interactions, and the countries that organize themselves, when you look at 2 interactions, they have similarities together. But since the dimensions themselves are a reflection of a total survey and a total overview of culture, what is the real benefit of grouping them that way? And that's my first question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I don't think the dimensions are reflections of the whole. They are a way of cutting up the pie. And the whole approach of science is to take a very complex amount of data and to try to simplify it to the extent that we can understand it. So, and the dimensions which I have are statistically independent, although sometimes under certain conditions, but basically they are supplying, one dimension is supplying information, another dimension is not supplying. So I do not agree with you that they are reflections of the whole. I think that it is important to see them separately. I have this discussion with my students sometimes because a student is making an analysis and tries to relate something he or she has observed to all my dimensions. I always say you shouldn't do that. You should determine which particular dimensions plays a role in this term and be parsimonious. I mean, the name of the game is to explain a thing in as simple terms as possible. So do not use more dimensions than necessary.
The second question I have, if I may, is that you mentioned that organizational practices are would influence the organizational condition, but aren't those practices then really an expression of a set of values that would be determined or set in place by the people who start or control an organization? So that even though they're practices, wouldn't they really reflecting a set of values?
Absolutely. The process, let's say, to the extent that organizations are founded at a given moment, some of them, they live on forever, so you can't even remember when they were founded. But organizations like companies that are founded tend to reflect the values of the founder. But then the values of the founder become the practices of the other people. One of the, I would say, the optimistic fallacies of analyses like Peters and Waterman in Search of Excellence would be that all the employees of a company would get the values of the founder. Well, this is very obviously not true. But if you are the founder of a company, you can establish the rules of the game which the other people have to follow. And if you establish good rules, you have a good company.
The last I had to do with your examples of opposites and how things are looked at in terms of good and bad, short and long. And I just got a copy of an interview, a spotlight interview, similar to the one that you had, by Professor Yao recently.
Who?
And he cited, you were mentioned.
Which profession?
Was it Yao in Hong Kong University. Just came out. And he was talking about culture and comparing China and the West. And he mentioned you and talked about the conflict and lack of conflict as being something that you made an example of at some point, I guess. and said that in China that wouldn't be the kind of opposition that would be used. The dilemma is because conflict would be compared with harmony. Mm-hmm. And so the question is then, how does that kind of, because you had a whole list of opposites, how does that then get reconciled into a cross-cultural discussion when even the idea of opposites isn't the same?
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the interview yet. I would say that I would be extremely happy if somebody, a Chinese thinker, would take issue with this, because this is precisely the way where we discover some things from another culture. I mean, he obviously has taken my work serious. Well, first of all, he's read it, and that he's taken it serious, and he comments, and I would take his comments extremely serious and try to see what it leads to. In fact, the research done by Bond, now you can say Bond is a Canadian, so he's also Western, but using the Chinese value survey, came out of a discussion where we precisely ask ourselves the question, is the way we ask so much structured by our Western background that we impose more or less the outcome on the people who answer the questions? And so we tried it, and that was not the case. But I'm happy to hear that these comments were made, but I can't react to them. I haven't seen them.
Time for one more short question. Yes.
This goes back to a question before the last one. In the notion of values as ideals, that they would be some kind of set of ideal values. Whether the members of the society or the culture live up to those ideals or not is another question. This would help to explain the pervasiveness and the long-lasting quality of these values. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. In my book, I make a distinction between values as the desirable and values as the desired. Which is in fact quite fundamental because they can be opposite. The one rather clear example is that if you have large power distance societies and small power distance societies, in a large power distance society, people will say that they think the society should be equal. However, if you ask them what kind of a boss they prefer, whether they want an authoritarian boss or a democratic boss, they say they want an authoritarian boss. So that's the difference between the desirable and the desired. And in the small power distance society, it's precisely reversed. People will say less that the society should be equal, but if you ask them, what kind of a boss would you like yourself? They say, I want a boss who asks me and doesn't tell me.
I'll now bring this to an official close. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the wife of Professor Hofstede, Mrs. Hofstede. We certainly appreciate her joining Professor Hofstede on this trip. The other thing I'd like to mention is I'll give you a little bit of my own reflections on Professor Hofstede's talk. Despite the fact that I have the good fortune to read most of your publications and sat in on a lot of your presentations, I always walk away with a deeper appreciation and understanding of cultures and its consequences. So thank you very much, Professor Hofstede. You were here last time in 1994, so it was 8 years since Professor Hofstede's last visit, and I certainly hope we don't have to wait another 8 years for Professor Hofstede to come around. So let's give Professor Hofstede a big applause. We also, at the David Lamb Center, has a small token of appreciation for Professor Hofstede's visit.
Mm-hmm. You want me to open it or not? Is it? No.
I don't think so. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the forum is officially adjourned. Thank you for coming.